Ready to go. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live events. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. Open Democracy, as probably most of you know, is an awesome news website, global news website committed to challenging power, inspiring change. If you're not already signed up to our newsletter, you can do so on the front page of our website, openDemocracy.net. We have a fantastic panel today. It is one of the thrills and privileges of my job that I get to work with so many awesome women. And two of them are joining us today, Cori Crider from Foxglove and our very own Caroline Molloy, openDemocracyUK. And we're going to be talking about a case that we've launched together. And I think I preamble this by saying, you know, we're journalists, Caroline and I are journalists, and as such, we didn't really expect to be spending so much of the last year fighting legal battles, issuing lawsuits, fighting in the courts for our right to access information. But that's actually been a big focus of our work for the last year and a half. So today we're going to be talking about our case, which involves consultation around NHS data and the big spy tech firm Palantir. And I wanted to start with Cori Crider. Cori, how did this all begin? Tell us how this all started, what happened, and also remind everyone how we came together on this.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time on this Thursday to come and talk to us. It's great that so many people care about this and have decided to participate in a panel about it. So Foxglove is a small nonprofit that exists generally to make tech fair. We set up about 18 months ago because we felt that both governments and large technology companies were kind of misusing our data to make decisions about all of us that they didn't ask us about, and that if we knew about it, necessarily wouldn't support. A couple of cases, just super briefly, that you might have heard of that we did. We brought a case against an algorithm that the Home Office had used to process every single visa application since 2015 until they conceded the case last year. So it determined the rights of everybody to come to the UK to study, to work. It decided kind of who missed the wedding, who got to come see the birth of their grandkid, who missed the funeral, and it turned out to be biased. So we, with the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants, judicially reviewed it, and the Home Office, to our surprise, caved. And the other one that we brought was against the infamous A-level algorithm that you probably heard about, that in a biased way determined all A-level kids' grades last year. Anyway, I've known Mary for a while. We go way back to when I was at a different human rights organization. But at the beginning of the pandemic, we sort of had our eye on this issue of data because we noticed a lot of different things happening with technology. There was a ton of talk, you may remember, about the artist formerly known as the notification app. Probably none of you have it on your phones anymore because it has face planted and doesn't really do anything of any particular use. But while there was a lot of oxygen and debate about that app at the time, we, as kind of little investigative lawyers and pokers around at things, thought, well, what else is going on here? And we saw a blog. It was a major kind of policy decision, but it was very quietly announced in a blog on NHS Digital at the end of March, announcing something that they called the COVID-19 data store. Now, that doesn't sound very exciting. You kind of might think, if you just heard those words, well, okay, fine, nothing to see here. Surely they need COVID-19 data. But what it essentially was the largest single lake, like massive mountain of health data ever put together in UK history. And the idea was that it was going to provide the UK government a single source of truth about the pandemic so that they could make informed and effective decisions to protect all of us. Now, let's leave aside for a moment the question of whether that has worked very well. Back at that time in March, we thought, well, that's very interesting, but what's going in there and on what terms? And also, who are the partners? And the blog named a whole bunch of different tech companies as partners. Some of them you would have already heard of. You've heard of Microsoft, you've certainly heard of Amazon, you've heard of Google, who kind of seemed to be involved and then it turned out weren't. But then there were two other companies that I think were less known then, but are actually really pretty important. One of them is one called Faculty AI, which is an AI company better known for providing the data science for the Vote Leave campaign. And then one, which is an old bugbear of mine as a human rights lawyer, is a kind of data firm called Palantir. Very briefly, Palantir they're not a health company really at all. And we were very surprised to see them involved with the National Health Service because actually their background is mainly in national security and the military. They did their first contracts running data aggregation and analysis for the CIA and special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. They then took some of their contracts over to help the Los Angeles and New York and other American police departments supposedly hunt down criminals. And then in 2019, they were pretty famous, and there was a huge controversy in the United States because their data analysis was used to fuel the deportation and ultimately family separation policies of US immigration and customs enforcement. So you've seen all of the kind of kids in cages at the US border, but there are tons and tons of raids that were supposedly powered by Palantir's tech. And in fact, Palantir itself faced a kind of, as we understand it, a kind of uprising from its own staff about that they were fueling this racist policy under the Trump administration. So anyhow, back in March, we saw this and we said, what the heck? What is a company like this doing at the heart of a health system where trust is absolutely imperative and trust in everybody in the health service? Let's see what else we can find out about this contract. We put in a couple of Freedom of Information Act requests. As you will know from Open Democracy's other work on FOI, this government's record on compliance with the Freedom of Information Act is not amazing. And we knew that we needed to work with some journalists really to try to get to the bottom of this. So then I basically, we found out Mary and we said, look, we're digging around at this. We're not getting much information out of it. What can you do with this? And so the first case that we worked with them on was essentially a transparency one. Isn't that right, Mary?
Indeed, yeah. I mean, you called and said we've submitted some FOIs, and I said, "Oh, good luck with that," because of course, one of the things that's happened during the pandemic, particularly, is that a system that was already creaking and just not working, where freedom of information requests were being submitted by journalists and members of the public, and there were delays. Many of them were getting ignored. Many of them were being delayed for months or years. So the system was already a problem, right? Our right to access information about what the government's up to and to hold our leaders accountable was already under massive strain. And then the pandemic comes along and the government acts as though that's a carte blanche to just completely ignore freedom of information requests. So when we first spoke, we had a sense that perhaps we weren't going to get the information we needed in a timely fashion. So what happened next, Cori?
So working with our legal team, our kind of crack lawyer, Rosa Curling, and some barristers who work, very hard for essentially no money at all, we pulled together legal papers and we said to them, listen, publish these contracts because actually these are tech companies. People are going to be very concerned about the involvement of their private health data and really intimate stuff being fed into this data store. People are going to be concerned. They want to know on what terms these companies are getting access to it. And there's a lot of stuff in that blog that says this is an emergency system, all the highest standards of pseudonymization, anonymization, all the stuff. We'll get into, Caroline will tell you a bit more about why that's actually a bit more complicated than it seems. But anyhow, but basically, they try to kind of say there, you don't need to worry here. But we thought, well, no, show us the papers, actually. So anyway, we wrote to them and said, listen, give it over. The journalists in particular have particular rights under the kind of constitution and common law of the United Kingdom, wholly apart from FOI to get this stuff. And if you don't do it, we're going to sue you. And they were kind of, no, a bit like Matt Hancock and the procurement stuff that he's recently found to have broken the law. And they were just said, we're not going to fill in these forms. We're a bit busy, Anyhow, and we said, no, we mean it. We're going to sue. And we were on our way. And like the day, basically, that we were going to lodge the proceedings, they gave us the contract. They handed over the contracts and they said, no, they didn't fancy being sued. And they gave them all over to us. And then Open Democracy, like the proper nonprofit journalistic outfit that they had, didn't do what, I think a private journalism outlet would have done. And they just gave them up to everybody. They published them on the internet. You can go and find them on the Open Democracy website now, if you care to read them. And it was really interesting. They actually changed something after we threatened to sue. Basically, they say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And here's a good example of this. The original contracts for that original data store, which Palantir, by the way, kind of suggested it was doing out of the goodness of its heart. The original contract they did essentially for free for the nominal sum of £1, had a little sting in the tail or a little interesting provision around the intellectual property. They basically said that any intellectual property that was specific to the project. So if they learned something about, I guess, how to model their data, they say they're not a learning system, but that doesn't mean they can't refine their product or improve their systems off of testing things on live health data. Anyway, so that intellectual property stayed with not the NHS, but with the companies. So although there was an emergency system that meant that, you know, all of the usual rules about data sharing, all the usual rules about procurement, all the usual rules about transparency weren't being followed, the companies who had very privileged access, historically massive access to health data as a result of the pandemic, suddenly potentially had the right to profit off of their access to that data. But we were assured, they said, well, we've changed it. Don't worry, don't complain about this, because we've changed the contract after it turns out after we put in our transparency thing. But that said, the data store stayed in place, of course. They said this is a vital resource for us to, again, make good decisions and protect the British people during the pandemic. But they at least changed that. They changed the provisions around IP. And we were then concerned, you know, as so often happens with these emergency systems, things that get rolled in a really hasty way under enormous pressure have a real habit of becoming permanent. And it looked to us like, you know, Palantir certainly hoped to stick around for the long haul in the National Health Service, and probably some of the other tech companies too. Caroline will tell you a bit more, but you know, this is part of a long history of tech companies really being very interested in, you know, the UK's health data, which is basically the most valuable set of health data in the world. But we then kind of put down a marker, you know, as Open Democracy's legal team, basically saying, look, you're on notice that we consider that this is an emergency, sure, but actually if you're going to extend this beyond the pandemic and for anything that has anything to do with stuff that isn't COVID, that actually you need to talk to the public about that, because that's beyond what you have the legal authority to do. It's quite frankly beyond what you have the political mandate to do. So that was what we said then. Anyway, go, Mary.
Well, indeed, yeah. I mean, so we saw the contracts, we forced them working together, we forced them to release the contracts. We looked through 160 pages of it. We discovered that what they'd assured us on many fronts turned out not to be correct, and that companies were potentially able to profit from these deals, and that it really didn't look like a short-term emergency measure. So as you say, we put them on notice and we said, hey, listen, if you're going to change, if this is going to become the new normal, if these deals are going to extend beyond COVID and there's going to be mission creep, then we, the public, deserve to be consulted about it. This is our data, this is our personal health information, and we should have a say. We believe that we have the legal right to have a say, but as Cori said, this is a democracy. We debate things. There needs to be a political mandate for changes of this nature. Cori, I will just feedback that a couple of people have asked you to speak a little bit more slowly, because I think
it is the absolutely constant feedback that I get. I'm so sorry. I always have too many coffees and then I speak.
But
I've been told it by many a judge, and I will do it again. Sorry.
But I think people are riveted. So we had this suspicion. We told them, listen, if this gets extended, we need consultation and we need transparency. And guess what? It didn't happen, because in December, they snuck through a massive £23 million 2-year contract with Palantir, which extends way beyond COVID to Brexit, to business planning, to all kinds of other purposes. And this contract was problematic for lots of other reasons, including the fact that we didn't even know what data sources were being fed in to the Palantir data store. And the thing that I found very, very sneaky about the whole business, and just really upset me as a journalist, was that they used the excuse of our threatened legal action to refuse to answer questions from other journalists about what they were doing with Palantir. So on the one hand, they were saying, yes, of course, you know, we'll consult, we're committed to being transparent, we're only going to do good things. And on the other hand, they were sneakily using our correspondence as an excuse to evade scrutiny. And they didn't tell us that this deal was being extended until after the fact, right before Christmas. I think it was on the eve of Christmas. This was revealed. So a couple of weeks after the deal had been signed, because they knew it was going to be unpopular and they knew there was going to be a fuss caused about this. So Cori, what happened next?
Well, I just want to actually, if I could just double down on that for a minute as well. It wasn't particularly cricket, because actually what they should have done, what a usual government department should do if they've got legal correspondence, there's this thing called the duty of candor, which, sounds very grand, but all it really means is the kind of spirit of fair play. And when a government body has got, legal letters from Open Democracy, then they're supposed to give information. They're under a base, it's like FOI, but that works. Like they're supposed to go.
Yeah, can you just clarify who they are? Because someone has asked, who have we been in correspondence with?
So the Department of Health and NHS England, and something called NHS Improvement, which is responsible for the acquisition of services and contracting parties. So it's a kind of mixture of Hancock and the NHS, and to be clear, it's their solicitors. So they hire a set of solicitors. If you care, it's a group called DAB Beechcroft. But anyway, but when they've got this, when they know that they are potentially facing a legal challenge, what they're supposed to do is give you information that would permit you, Open Democracy, to decide whether to sue or not. And what they actually did in December was kind of ignore us and then bounce the contract through and come back and say, oh, by the way, it's already signed and we don't agree with your legal arguments. If they'd done it the right way around, if they'd said, we don't agree with your legal arguments and we're about to sign it, then it might well be that Open Democracy could have come in and tried to stop the problematic parts of it in advance. But they hoped that it would be basically too little, too late, and that we would just go away. And the contract, I don't know if did you say this, for how long it is and so forth? It's 2 years.
23 million pounds.
2 years. I mean, look, I don't know about all the rest of you, but I hope not to be talking to any of you about COVID in December of 2022. I really, really, really hope that we will be arguing about something else at that point. And thank God for the vaccine rollout. It looks to me like maybe that will happen. But that was that is when the penny dropped and we realized that our fears weren't just kind of late night terrors with no basis, but in fact, this temporary system was on its way to becoming the permanent state of affairs. And that would mean, if they did it, that's total renegotiation of the kind of data settlement for the whole National Health Service. Now, this contract doesn't go all that way, right? It doesn't do everything, it doesn't say, but it is absolutely the thin end of the wedge for reorganizing and renegotiating how your health data is managed and handled without actually asking your permission or giving you a say. And that's where, again, we talked to Open Democracy. We said, look, we actually think that people are entitled to a say. They're legally entitled to a say. And the contract is probably legally defective for that reason.
And so then, yeah, explain the case we're now bringing. So that just to recap, they hoped we would go away because a fait accompli, the deal's already done, too late. We weren't going to take that lying down. So what happened next, Cori?
Now, I'm about to say what I think are the 4 least sexy letters in the English language, which are GDPR. In the office, I try to make myself more happy about them by singing them to the YMCA theme tune, which you may try at home. I'm not going to actually do it, but it makes it sound a bit more fun. I know that all of you associate the GDPR with like an officious intermeddler with like spectacles and a clipboard, and probably just with those annoying things on your website that are why the web is so annoying to surf all the time. But actually, listen, it sounds so tedious, like that is the least sexy thing ever. It matters. It's a regulation. It's just like the regulation that keeps chlorine out of your chicken or smog out of the air. It actually is. It's an incredibly important law that it says a whole bunch of stuff about the way that your data is being treated. And remember, data is power these days. It's how all kinds of decisions are being made about you. And anyway, basically, without getting into a whole bunch of tedious detail, your data protection rights say that they have to, when they're making really massive decisions, such as the processing of health data on a national scale, they've got to consider the impact on people's rights. It's something called, God help us, a data protection impact assessment, where they have to consider people's rights. And as part of that, it says where it is appropriate, they're supposed to consult us. They're supposed to talk to us about what they're doing, why, what the risks are, what the benefits are, and actually have an engaged conversation with us as the public. It says where appropriate, but listen, if it isn't appropriate for this, where your very most intimate health data has been fed into a national database that is being managed by CIA-linked companies, if it ain't appropriate then to consult, then when is it appropriate? Which is basically the legal basis of the challenge. And they haven't done any of it. I mean, they haven't even engaged in a kind of tick box exercise. Not only have they not talked to you, they just haven't filled in the form at all. They haven't engaged at all with the exercise. They've just skipped the step, just like Matt Hancock skipped the step of telling you about the other contracts he's awarded. You know, there's a kind of, oh, well, we can't really be bothered with any of this because we're a bit busy. And actually, that's not okay. That's not okay.
It's not okay to use a pandemic or a crisis as an excuse to evade accountability and responsibility for what you are supposed to be doing to as an elected official, as a leader and as a public servant. So we are bringing a case to demand that they actually do this exercise and to establish the fact that these exercises like these need to be done and they need to be done before contracts are signed. So I'm going to go to Caroline now, because Caroline is far more expert in many of these questions than either Cori or I, because she's been reporting on the NHS and questions to do with public health policy for many, many years. And Caroline, it would just be great for you to broaden the picture out. You know, why does this matter? What is so valuable about our data and about our National Health Service? And therefore, why should we be consulted, and why should we be concerned, and why should this be something that the public engages with and debates fully?
Well, I think, a monetary value has been put on our NHS data. I think Ernst & Young valued it at 10 billion a year or so ago. And there's been long-standing doubt, I think, about whether the UK government, firstly, whether it recognises the value of that data, and secondly, whether it recognises it in a way that, you know, the predominant emphasis of what it's going to do with that data is improve healthcare for everyone. I mean, the last 20 years are littered with initiatives where the government has, presented a new IT initiative and told us that what this is about improving our healthcare. Some listeners might remember the Connecting for Health situation under Tony Blair, where we spent anything between, I think it was 12 billion, possibly up to 20 billion, essentially to do what they're now saying they're trying to do still, which is actually make your health records from when you go to the GP or the hospital talk to each other. Not a very complicated thing to do, and something which the public are really happy to do. And actually the public think that kind of already happens, because we spent £20 billion on it, but nothing seemed to happen. I remember speaking at the time to people. I wasn't reporting on health then, but I had friends who were working on that project who told me the reason that nothing seemed to happen, and this may begin to sound familiar, is because there was a public objective and then there was a private objective. And if you give computer programmers, who are quite logical people, two conflicting objectives, you're going to get, garbage in, garbage out. And so the public objective, as ever, as we see now, is about, whether it's solving the pandemic or transforming the NHS going forward, is that to provide better care. What we saw with Connecting for Health project and with previous NHS IT projects is that so much of it is about setting up systems which enable a monetary value to be put on people's health needs and on the services that are being delivered. So Connecting for Health unfolded in a context which we are still in, essentially, where healthcare is split up into the pot of money and the people providing it. And we have so many commercial entities now competing to provide it. So, we have these kind of conflicting objectives. We're never quite sure. And I think, the single most important thing that we have in our healthcare system and in our health, actually, I would say, is trust. The NHS is, if you read the kind of strategies around like what to do with NHS data from various sort of official and less official influencers, they all say the NHS is the body which people trust more than any other in this country with their personal data. The thing is something like usually upwards of 2/3 to almost 100%, depending on how you ask the question, people say we trust the NHS with our data, compared to, interestingly, as low as 37% who say they trust the government, central government, with personal data.
So, yeah, I wanted to ask a follow-up there, because and this is something that's been asked in the Q&A as well. We are saying that there are good uses of technology and good uses of health data. Someone in the chat asked, do you think that public services should be digitized and modernized? What good things can happen? And we are not Luddites. We know that there is tech and data. There are good uses of tech and data that can deliver better public health outcomes and more equitable public health outcomes. So I want to put that question to both of you, to you first, Karen, and then to you, Cori. Explain what the issues we have here and what good and equitable would look like.
I mean, again, I come back to the issue of if you ask the public. I mean, quite often the public, when they do these sort of surveys, the commentary on it accuses the public of being Luddites and say, oh, they just don't really understand. Actually, I think the public understand quite well. So, they are generally speaking very happy for data to be shared in a way that is going to improve their individual care. And also, so long as it is appropriately anonymized, they're happy for it to be used for the purposes of scientific research. And they're a bit ambivalent, actually, public, about when it's used for the purposes of service planning, perhaps because they don't quite understand what service planning means. Service planning, essentially, what healthcare services am I going to offer in this region or not? So I think one of the issues is that, but there's very, very strong drop-off in public support for the use of that data, even when anonymized, when you get into healthcare, sort of into tech companies. I saw a figure today and it was saying it's 12.2% of people want their data to be shared, even if anonymized, and even if used for the purposes of improving health, with tech companies. Because I think the public are quite skeptical of some of the claims made both by, this is going to be essentially commercial entities who are providing products, whether it be pharmaceuticals or health tech, that is always going to improve their health in the way that that's advertised. They're also quite skeptical of the claims of healthcare planners, who are often these days effectively management consultancy firms in different regions of the UK, who are saying, oh, we're going to scoop up a load of data and we are going to use it to transform your health services. And people often see that and then see that their health services are cut or the local hospitals closed down. So, I think there is a responsible use of data, but the more you have these kind of commercially confidential contracts where you're not telling people who, I find it utterly insulting and outrageous that the government can say, I'm not even going to assess the impact of this deal on your personal health data and your personal health privacy. Trust us, it's for your own good. Well, I'm not that trusting, I'm afraid. Maybe that's why I'm a journalist.
Earned, right? Trust is earned, and it's earned by a culture of working in the open and giving people as much as you possibly can, particularly when it's the most, I don't know about your medical record, everybody on this call, but I've definitely got some stuff in my medical record that I don't want Google to have, and I don't want Palantir to have associated with me. That's just how it is. Just a couple of things. On the kind of good thing, definitely this is not about trying to spike trustworthy and public spirited uses of health data. And to give you an example of something that has been done during the pandemic in a way that I think has been more open and is more interesting. The kind of open safely protocol done by Ben Goldacre and a big team of people at Oxford is open source. You can see the code and is trying to get it and basically it is providing a research platform where, rather than everybody having to have the data, you can run a query and then the query comes back out without you having to have access to all of the data yourself. Forgive my kind of extremely basic and reductive explanation, but that's the basic idea. But on trust with issues like Palantir, let's talk about something very very concrete about trust and the health service in this country. We've all seen since the start of the year the government's campaigns about what they're calling vaccine hesitancy, right? Which is basically, in communities where there's a trust deficit in the government because of all kinds of sound historical reasons to do with people being mistreated by one or another part of the government, people who are, let's say, migrants may not be coming forward for the vaccine because they think that the moment that they interface with the health service, again, with some reason, that they will then be dobbed in to the Home Office as part of the hostile environment, or have they, I think they've rebranded it, haven't they? Aren't we calling it the compliant environment now? I think the original label of the Home Office was more accurate. So anyway, I'm going to keep calling it the hostile environment. You know, people, if you're a migrant, and I think there are estimated to be something like 400,000 undocumented people in this country. If you are a migrant and the Home Office says, no, don't worry. You can totally come and get vaccinated, and that's not going to be shared with the Home Office and used to deport you. You can imagine that quite a number of people don't trust it. And similarly, we understand that some parts of the Black and Asian communities have significantly lower rates of vaccine uptake than people who are more privileged and less experience of, reasons to mistrust the state. And the government are right to be trying to shore up that trust deficit. We all, none of us are safe unless all of us are safe, and no more than in a pandemic. We all want everybody to get the jab. But what seems interesting to me is that out of the one hand, they're saying, please trust the NHS, trust the government, go and get your jab. Well, at the same time, installing potentially for the long term in health architecture, a firm that has been deeply implicated in the targeting and frankly misery visited on some of these communities in the United States and internationally, Palantir. I don't know, can you really put your hand on your heart and say to the Muslim community in London, please go get your jab, but also don't worry, like the people who are managing logistics are Palantir, who you may have heard of from our prior counterinsurgency work in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just don't see, from a trust perspective, it just seems odd. They're not the only game in town. They're not the only data integrator in town. They're not the only people who do data viz. They're really not. And yet here they are. Oh God, we haven't even done the thing about how it came about, like how we think that they won this contract and the kind of cocktails. We haven't even done that bit.
Well, we're coming to cocktails in a moment.
Okay.
Caroline wanted to come in on that point.
Please do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the open source thing. I was talking to some experts the other day who were saying, and again, this was so familiar from the history of UK NHS IT stuff, really. They're saying, what Palantir does, yeah, they're arguably quite good at it. You'll read different opinions on that. But there's plenty of other options, including open source options. And actually, I think there's also an issue about kind of Britain's responsibility in the world here. Like, we have the most valuable, because of our uniquely comprehensive healthcare system, we have the most valuable healthcare system in the world. Whatever Palantir are saying, it will be useful to them in one way. If they can solve this nut, if they can crack the nut of the kind of slightly messy NHS systems, they can do that anywhere. And that will put them in an incredibly strong position for much larger global markets in China and India and places like this. And what we see, is real concern at international level about, I think, what's often called data colonialism, that what's happening is that data is being scooped up, not just from us, but from lots of poor countries, and taken away and analysed, when what those countries need is the open source tools, which we should be using too, to actually then analyse their own data and get the value out of what is their citizens' data and should belong to them. So it's another form of extractivism at a colonial level, as well as a concern here, I think.
And the inequities in the vaccine rollout is just another example of how privilege distorts who gets protected and who gets access to the public health services they need. I wanted also to pick up back on Cori's point about trust, because you're absolutely right that a company with a track record like Palantir would give concern to many groups and communities, particularly in this country and across the world, but also the nature of the way that the deal was sealed. So we've already talked about the secrecy and the sneaking behind our backs and the using our lawsuit as an excuse to evade questions from journalists. But we also discovered more, or indeed our friends at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism discovered more, which seemed to underline the fact that this wasn't a short-term emergency measure that Palantir was brought in suddenly and without forethought on this data deal. And how do we know that, Cori? Please tell us the story about cocktails.
Well, God help us, Crofton actually got something out of FOI. You know, I don't know who he gave a cocktail to do that. But anyway, so basically, Crofton Black, my old colleague and journalist at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, got his hands on some documents, some emails, basically, between NHS officials and Palantir brass, and also people in the Department of International Trade. And the long and the short of it is that that looks like Palantir, installing Palantir in some way in the health service has been the plan for a while. Going back as far as kind of the middle of late spring, early summer 2019, just when this kind of flagship data initiative called NHSX is kicking off, having its launch party, the chair of NHS England, who's Baron David Pryor, was hosted by Palantir to chair a dinner, you know, at which he was going to talk about the possibilities of health data. We don't know, you know, I wish I could say we had a source in the dinner, but we don't. But all we know from these emails is that the next day, Lewis Mosley came in and said, I'm really confident that Palantir is well placed to help the UK kind of pioneer the next kind of wave of data-driven treatments and all the rest of this. And, you know, Baron Pryor comes back and says, well, you know, thank you so much for the fascinating decision and also for the delicious watermelon cocktails. And, you know, listen, I mean, maybe it didn't have any role in the company getting its emergency contract when the emergency then came around, but there was certainly a non-trivial amount of whining and dining going on. And by the way, that wasn't the only meeting. There were then also, you can see in the emails, and this is all in the report. We wrote it, you know, Open Democracy wrote it up, but so did the Bureau. And you should go look at the Bureau of Investigative. Oh, look, there it is in the chat. Definitely read it. But there were also, there were meetings that, you know, Davos, I don't even, you know, I'm not part of this kind of ski meeting set, so I don't even know how to pronounce the thing. But anyhow, you know, the people, the rich people on the mountain summit, there was a sort of, there was a pre-briefing for the Department of International Trade that showed that the department was really keen to roll out the red carpet for Palantir. They were kind of musing in their emails, in their briefing notes for the meeting between DIT officials and Lewis Mosley and Palantir people. You know, how can we help them? How can we help them get a foothold in the UK more? You know, how can we help with their presence? Can we help with real estate or visas or things like this? And I have to say, if I were another business who was hoping to bid, I would definitely think like, wow, nice work if you can get it. Like, how do I get the DIT to help me out in global Britain like this? And it's particularly odd when it isn't just, you know, it isn't just a regular old private investor who wants to come and build a factory to sell, I don't know, cars. I mean, this is a company whose a huge percentage of its business is government business. So it's the DIT rolling out the red carpet for somebody who's going to come and bid for government contracts, which again, going back to this question of trust, I mean, Open Democracy, I'm sure you guys have read, has done reporting left, right, and center on kind of COVID cronyism in general. And this just, I mean, this sadly feels like a bit of a piece of that, where, you know, there was a very strenuous lobby effort to install them, not just as an emergency system, but potentially in the long term.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that I should absolutely plug the other work here done by colleagues. You know, over the past year and a half, COVID cronyism is something we've unearthed and just keep discovering more and more details about. You know, there's the £350 million contract landed by Lord Ashcroft, who's a serious conservative donor, friends of Dominic Cummings, a PR firm called Public First, which is now the subject of litigation, dodgy PPE contracts, failings by Deloitte, by Serco. You know, the list goes on. We're actually pretty exhausted by it because it keeps coming. And this issue, this contract is part of that wider problem with cronyism that we've seen during the pandemic, and it really cannot become the new normal. Hence, so many court cases being triggered, so much time that we've spent working with lawyers, because we think that there need to be consequences, and that if we, the public and journalists, don't fight for our right to be consulted, to debate, to scrutinize, then we will lose it long term. And that's a really, really fundamental problem in the workings of a democracy. Caroline, go ahead.
I just wanted to come back in because I saw a question in the chat about what impact it's going to, that some of it's a bit abstract and what impact it's going to have on ordinary people.
Just to clarify that you're answering about how private tech firms involved in our NHS will impact ordinary people. So go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I think, one of the, even leaving aside the concerns about, this particular company, and I completely agree with the points that have been made about trust and the damage to trust, and the fact that, the poorer you are, the older you are, and the darker skinned you are, the less already you trust, the government with your data, and the greater already your experience of being overly surveilled, and not just surveilled, but punished and excluded. So, an example of a company, not Palantir, but Optum, which is also very active in the English NHS system, an American healthcare firm, had an algorithm which was calculating how much healthcare, it wasn't really about individual privacy, it was about community level, but that was still a problem because they were calculating how much healthcare particular areas were going to need and how much funding they were going to need. And they looked and they said, oh yeah, those areas don't seem to have historically spent so much on healthcare, so they don't seem to need so much on healthcare. And what it turned out was the reasons those areas hadn't spent so much on healthcare was historic racism, because they were predominantly Black areas. So what that algorithm was effectively doing was replicating that historic prejudice. And they had to apologize and say that they would never use that algorithm again. But these things, these proprietary algorithms are in black boxes, and we are relying, the way that the government is approaching this contract and so many others is to say that we trust the company's systems, and they're going to the companies and saying, we don't really know what we want you to do. Can you tell us what you can do for us? Giving away really this treasure trove of data, I would say. And also, I think, there's all sorts of other consequences that come. The fact that they have not, I'm sorry to harp on about it, but it really bothers me, the fact they have not told us what data is going in to this new source of truth, not just about COVID, but about business as usual, means that we cannot have a democratic conversation about, I don't even think we should use the word data, actually. It's about information, data sounds like it's just numbers, but we need to have, we're working in a context where the UK government is talking about radical data-driven transformation of the NHS. It has a white paper on the table, which is very unclear what its thinking really is. It has a very secretive task force with lots of people from the genomics industry and life sciences industry involved. We're also working in a context of Brexit and trade deals where we know that the US wants to establish precedents where it can get free flows of data to monetize them. So there's a lot going on here, and we need to be, for me, for my money, the reason, I could be proved wrong tomorrow, Mary, but the reason they haven't done a data protection impact assessment is because they would have to tell us what data is going in, and we might well be looking at it going, well, why exactly do you want to know that? Because there is a separate trend that has been, I have been very concerned about in my coverage of healthcare for a long time, which is around sort of individualizing and blaming people for their own poor health. And I think people are very conscious of this. They're aware that on some level that they are seen, someone who is quite sick is already aware that they are often seen as a burden. And some of the way that this data has been used, has been to label people as costly patients, and we are not too many steps away, I fear, from the time when people are they are already talking about giving people sort of individualized pots of money to pay for their healthcare in the same way that they already do for social care. So we need to be seeing what data is going in so that we can have an idea of what kind of policy making is going on, even before we get to the stage of what is this private company going to be doing with it. And the last thing I would add, which I think costs us all dear, is that, the outputs of these very, dare I say, oversold, they seem to me to be somewhat oversold if they need watermelon cocktails to plug them. The outputs of these data lakes and dashboards always as well seems to require not just the companies like Palantir and Faculty, but an army of people from McKinsey and Deloitte and all of these management consultants to interpret them. And I think, again, in this pandemic, we've seen what's already been the case for people watching NHS privatization, is that we do not get value for money from these consultants who come in and, who after all have private clients who they assure us there's a dividing wall between their advice to government and their private clients. But, so this whole data-driven approach, I think, needs to be questioned, and the secretive way that it's done through outsourcing makes that very difficult.
Thank you. Yeah, I think because to summarize, the problems with private firms having access are, we don't know what they're doing. We don't know what protections are in place. There are risks or concerns about communities or people not getting adequate services or being treated differently as a result of this. And there's a sort of bigger democratic accountability question. So it's both kind of the individualized question of, will your healthcare be worse, or will you be, disqualified for certain things, or will you face certain costs, and community level, and then sort of at the democratic political level as well. So we always do this at Open Democracy panels. We always ask and talk about, what can we do about this? This is something that several people have already asked. Are there changes in the law needed? Should we all be submitting subject access requests to find out what information they hold about us? Are there opt-outs available? So I just wanted to put that question to you first, Cori. What can we do as what can participants on this call do?
I mean, we will start doing a kind of democratic engagement exercise. We don't currently have a petition up, but I think we probably are going to put up a petition. So watch this space with Foxglove and Open Democracy in the next little while, because in a way, like I said, and it's important to say it again, this isn't just about one company and one dashboard and data store. It really isn't. This is about a wider debate about the future of the NHS, which is being written now in the final chapters of the pandemic. Matt Hancock has put out a white paper, which he hopes to become a law about reorganizing the whole NHS. And it's got a bunch of tantalizing but vague paragraphs in there about unlocking the potential of your data. Now, there's a version of that future, if it's public spirited and preserves the public value of this immense public asset that is our health data, and doesn't undermine the idea that it is free at the point of delivery for everyone and doesn't dilute the quality of people's care, that could be fine. That indeed it could be good. But there is another version of it that starts to look like creeping encroachment of companies who want to cut costs and make money off of the NHS that I don't think we should be naive about and think will improve our care. And that future is still open. Everything is to play for, but you will only have your say in that debate if you demand it. So there's that. You can speak up and you can demand your say, and we will provide, through Open Democracy's amazing platform, various vehicles for you to have your say. So that's one. I mean, on the legal thing, like, does the law need to be changed? Does the law need to be enforced? I think Caroline has got quite a lot to say about why the law isn't good enough, but we could start by following the laws that we have. One of the things that's been quite worrisome about the pandemic is the way that the government has used it as carte blanche to not comply with a whole range of the laws that ordinarily protect us. We've talked about transparency through freedom of information. We've talked about, public knowing about who gets government deals through procurement. And we've talked about data protection. These things are here to protect us. They're here to give us confidence in the government. And, one of the things that you notice about the government is that they're looking to water down these protections over time. So again, I know nobody's very excited about data protection, but I tell you, the government don't like it, and they quite like to water it down, because Oliver Dowden has floated in the FT this week an article that, it's short, but it's basically a trial balloon that says, no, we don't have to do all this European nonsense. And actually, we might need a liberalized regime to improve innovation. Anytime somebody tells you that the regulation stops people innovating, you really need to ask yourself the question of what it's about. So that's one thing. I think, let's try and hang on to what we've got, and let's actually follow the laws, particularly as we kind of come out of the depths of the emergency.
Thank you. Yeah, and I will definitely add a plug here, because with this is not the only legal case we're fighting. We will absolutely be calling on all of you to participate and make your voices heard in the coming weeks and months on this case. So if you haven't already signed up to Open Democracy's newsletter, please do so. Julian will put the link in the chat. We can keep you informed and we can let you know when you can add your voices. The other thing, and again, it's my job to say this, but we need investigative journalism to investigate what's going on, to ask questions, to demand answers. So if you think that it's very important that journalists hold power to account, not only by reporting what's going on, but insisting, demanding, working with brilliant outfits like Foxglove to bring cases to protect our right to know what's going on, then please consider supporting us. And again, the link is in the chat. But I think it's very important also to be aware of the fact that as Cori said, we do have laws in place that need to be protected and upheld. We are arguing about our freedom of information rights at the same time at the Information Tribunal, because, if you remember the start of this conversation, the start of Cori's story was about submitting freedom of information requests. That is information that we are legally entitled to access. And there are laws in place to make that happen. So a large part of this battle is just fighting those cases for the law to be upheld. But Caroline also thinks that the laws that we had before the pandemic weren't good enough. And I would certainly agree with that. On freedom of information, there are many ways in which the law needs to be enhanced. We need to be able to better access what private companies are up to when they interact with public bodies. But Caroline, how else do you think that we actually need the law to be strengthened and changed?
I mean, the first thing to say is that in terms of the laws that govern the NHS, as Cori and myself have said, they are currently, they have a white paper and they're drafting legislation at the moment to change the law. The reporting of that white paper has been so misleading, I would say, and we will be covering this more going forward. So it's kind of been presented as this sort of, oh, we're undoing all that nasty privatisation stuff that David Cameron did a few years ago. And it's doing nothing of the sort. And one of the things it's doing is actually, in effect, entrenching the kind of state of emergency that we've had around procurement and the way that they've been able to kind of hand out contracts in this rather unregulated way. Well, that's quite explicitly what they say they're going to do going forward, under the guise of busting bureaucracy, that we're still going to have a market in healthcare, but it's just going to be a less regulated market, and it's not going to be so cumbersome around the whole bidding process. So basically all those kind of emergency type deals that we've had that have been so dodgy over the last year, I think, NHS watchers say that sets up the potential for more. What I would say though is that, just having a nicely regulated market, for me personally, is not sufficient. And that actually, even prior to COVID, there was lots of issues with, essentially you have a disparity of power because you have these huge global multinational corporations, very wealthy corporations, bidding for bits and pieces of the NHS. And, we can't compete. And then they get those contracts. Then there often seems to be some backstage wrangling where actually things change post-contract signing. And more importantly, I think this does create a whole layer of bureaucracy, not the bureaucracy that Matt Hancock's going to bust. He's not going to do anything about this unless we make him and join NHS campaigners to make him, which is to actually address the fact that, if you have the NHS set up like a market with pots of money that people are getting their hands on, whether it's through competition or just direct award, that creates a huge amount of bureaucracy and bean counting, which, frankly, the NHS has got better things to do. And it has people working in it who are public servants who do not need, I would argue, this kind of market discipline. I mean, for me, just to finish, the fact that we actually even think about needing Palantir to glue together different bits of the NHS information architecture is reflective of the fact that we've had this kind of marketized, fragmented system with everyone competing against each other, buying their own different proprietary IT systems that aren't talking to each other. We do need currently some glue to glue those together. It doesn't have to be Palantir, it could be something open source. But in the long term, I think we have to think a bit more fundamentally about how our health services run.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think so.
Really briefly. I mean, just, it's really basic, but I'm a proud dual national. I'm American, but I am now also British, and I've made this country my home, and I love it. And one of the things I most love about it is that how people value the National Health Service, right? I come from a state, I mean, I come from Texas, where people die because their GoFundMe for insulin comes up $50 short. And I just think that anything that looks like the introduction of, you know, kind of swinging profit motives and cost and absolutely to the bone cuts to the NHS, anything that looks like that, you want to keep your eye out for, because you don't want to look at your sisters across the Atlantic and go anything like in that direction. That's just my piece.
Amen. As a fellow dual national of the US and the UK as well, believe me, it is better over here at the moment. Thank you so much to my fantastic panelists. I want to give Foxglove another shout out and plug. Please sign up to their newsletter and learn more about them. It's been fantastic working with you, Cori, and with everyone at Foxglove. And watch this space. There's going to be far more. Thank you so much, Caroline. Absolute pleasure to have you both on today, and thank you all for joining. This conversation has been recorded and will be downloadable after the fact. We'll be sending that out in our newsletter as well. And thanks everyone for just making the time today and for listening and for supporting us. Bye-bye.